Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Hoskins from the University of Glasgow in the UK, with my good friend and colleague, Professor Amanda Barney at Macquarie University, Sydney, Australia. We're founding editors of the Cambridge Journal of Memory, Mind and Media. And we're delighted that the inaugural article of Memory, Mind and Media is Dan Schacter's Media, Technology and the Sins of Memory. Professor Daniel Schacter is William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. He's a world-leading expert on the nature and function of human memory, the author of several books, several hundred articles. His books, Searching for Memory and The Seven Sins of Memory, were both named notable books of the year by the New York Times and both winners of the APA's William James Book Award. He's also received numerous awards for his work and has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. So I'm really delighted to say that Professor Schacter has agreed to talk with me on his new article and more generally about memory and media. Thanks very much for taking the time to speak with me, Dan.
Thank you, Andrew. I look forward to it.
Great. So, perhaps we could start within your pioneering book, The Seven Sins of Memory. And of course, the new updated edition, September 2021. And it's from that you draw out some key themes for your article on memory, mind and media. So it was what, 22 years ago when you first introduced this idea? So the first three sins, omission, so transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking.
Yep.
And the next four you call sins of commission, suggestibility, bias, persistence, and misattribution. So could you just say a bit about in which these areas you've seen the most significant developments in our understanding of human memory over over 2 decades now?
Yeah, that's really interesting question. It's one that I've had a chance to ponder because, as you point out, 22 years ago is the very first article I wrote on the seven sins, and then the book followed in 2001. And that was, of course, my attempt just to organize the landscape of memory errors and breakdowns, and resulting in the seven sins that you noted. So when I went back to do the update 20 years later of the book, I had the chance to look at each of the seven sins and assess what's new, what's interesting, what's important in the last 20 years. And so I wrote 2 updates for each of the sins. So I'm not going to go through all those 14 updates, 7 times 2, but what I will say, I think there was significant progress in all 7, both with respect to basic understanding, mechanistic understanding of what's going on to produce these sins, and I think with application to everyday life. And interestingly, I certainly think one of the new areas of research that was not around, at least in its current form and most relevant to my article, is the question of how does technology impact our memory, or technology with respect to the internet and social media, etc. So that's certainly one area where we're seeing work that was not done at all prior to 2001. But I will make this point. I think perhaps from my perspective, the most interesting new findings and progress came from not research on one of the sins per se. Most interesting to me in terms of the progress over the last 20 years was not so much what we've learned about each of the 7 sins, but rather what we've learned about one of the overarching themes that was in the 2001 book, which is that while we tend to think of these quote unquote sins as glitches in memory, or maybe breakdowns in evolution, blunders in evolution. How could we end up with a memory system where I forget so much, or we have these very costly distortions? But one of the main themes in the 2001 book was that we really shouldn't look at it that way, that for the most part, these memory sins are prices that we pay for adaptive features in memory. So perhaps the easiest example of that to see would be this, what I call the sin of persistence, intrusive memories, memories of trauma, for example, that might keep you up at night. You can't get them out of your mind, can be psychologically very devastating. And yet, one of the arguments I made back then was that we want a memory system that strongly preserves emotionally arousing and threatening experiences, things that could jeopardize our survival. We want that. So I had a whole chapter trying to outline how each of the sins we could think of from this adaptive perspective. And I brought in evolutionary thinking and other perspectives. But what we didn't have then was much evidence, hard evidence on these points. And now, one of the things I write about in my update on this last chapter, an adaptive perspective, is that, hey, we really do have some interesting evidence that's emerged in the last 20 years. A couple of quick examples. One of the phenomena that I barely talked about in 2001 because it had barely been mentioned is something interesting known as the fading affect bias. So this is the phenomenon that negative affect tends to fade more quickly than positive affect over time, so that we're spared the sting of some upsetting experiences. Now, there are limits to that. For example, trauma that results in persisting memories. But what we now know is that this fading affect bias is associated with a lot of positive results. For example, people who have a stronger fading affect bias, that is, over time, the negative affect fades more quickly than positive affect, tend to have less anxiety, tend to be less plagued by anxiety. They're characterized by higher levels of grit, determination to succeed. So that's one example. And then there are other examples as well, where, for example, one of the main themes in my lab's work over the last 20 years has been that we use memory to think ahead and plan for and simulate novel future events. This is something that in my work and in others largely came on the scene after 2001. And one of my arguments has been that we use these very flexible, what I call episodic recombination processes, where we're able to take bits and pieces of different experiences, recombine them, and simulate novel future events. That's a very adaptive process. However, what we have argued in that line of work is that the very flexibility of memory that makes it useful for simulating the future can also contribute to memory errors, such as memory misattributions, where you misremember the source of an experience. And indeed, my lab has provided evidence on that point just in the last few years that I go into in the book. So that's where I think some of the really most important advances have been made.
Great, that's wonderful. Great examples there. And to push you on your article a bit further, again, the kind of broader question is where the media and technology are kind of ruining our memory.
Right.
And you kind of, point out that conclusions people draw from this work tend to confuse a number of aspects. So you have this wonderful typology of task-specific effects, domain-specific effects, and domain general effects. So could you say a bit more about why they're important? And I'm really intrigued and interested from my perspective as a social scientist, because, and this is my presumption, obviously, that my understanding is that the domain general effects you talk about would be really, more the domain of the social sciences. So, when we talk of memory at a collective or societal level. So I guess there's a number of parts to that question, and about how, how we might generalize from the task specific and the domain specific out into the wider world, I guess.
Yeah, good question. One of the things that struck me in just pulling together material for writing this article, I'm thinking about how technology and media relate to the 7 sins of memory, is that there are a lot of really strong claims out there, more typically in the popular press rather than in the scientific literature, with headlines that I quote, such as, technology is killing our memory, or how is technology ruining your memory? But what's not made clear in some of these articles is what exactly do you mean when you say that? And so in surveying the literature, it occurred to me that it's important to draw the distinction that you refer to between a task-specific, a domain-specific, and a domain general effect. So let me just walk through a concrete example that I talk about in the paper that illustrates this. the effect of GPS on memory. So most of us rely on GPS to one degree or another. And there are claims out there that, hey, you're relying on GPS, this is going to ruin your memory. Well, what exactly do you mean? So a task-specific effect with GPS would occur if, when I'm using GPS, I have poor memory for that exact route on which I'm using GPS, but there are no further effects. If you ask me about exactly how I got from point A to point B, after using GPS, the idea would be that I'm not going to remember as much as if I was doing it on my own. Indeed, there are experiments in the literature that I review in the article that support that point. But I don't think that's what people are talking about, or just that. Sure. The next level would be maybe GPS has a domain-specific effect. So what would that mean? That would mean that when I'm using GPS, I'm not only impairing my memory for that route, but I'm impairing my memory for other spatial information or other route finding tasks. So if I use GPS enough from that perspective, it's not just that I'll have bad memory for the exact route on which I'm using GPS. I might have poor spatial memory for other routes when I'm walking from point A to point B, not even when I'm not using GPS, or other kinds of spatial information, but that the effect would be restricted to this broad domain, let's say, of spatial information. Exactly how we define a domain is an interesting question, but I'm using the term in the general spirit. Domain might be visual memory, spatial memory, auditory memory, things of that nature. Then the final thing we might mean when we say GPS is ruining our memory is that if we use GPS enough, we're going to have domain general impairments of our memory. Not only will my memory be poor for a variety of routes and spatial information, I might also have more difficulty remembering what I had for dinner last night, or I might have more difficulty learning information for an exam that has nothing to do with space. Now, my reading of the literature is that I think the spirit of it is that a lot of these claims really are, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, about domain general effects, that technology is just blowing away your memory. Well, what do the data say? The data say that there are some task-specific effects for sure. That's been established with GPS. And in other areas that I talk about, for example, does taking a photograph impair your memory for that event? There's some evidence of task-specific effects that you have under certain conditions, poor memory for an event if you take a photo of it. Not all conditions, but some. Finally, I found really very little evidence for domain general effects in any of the areas of technology that I discussed. However, there were some interesting suggestions of what might be a domain general effect in work from various researchers on the topic of media multitasking. Right. So people who are chronically engaging in media multitasking, checking their phones and checking social media when they're doing other tasks, they do this routinely. There is some evidence that those folks are more prone to breakdowns in memory that result from attentional failures. Yeah. Those potentially could be domain general, but even there, it's not clear whether it's just that people who have poor memory and attention abilities to begin with are more likely to engage in multitasking versus multitasking being the cause of their poor memory.
So, I mean, that's a point, I guess I'm particularly interested in terms of, that generalizing to a wider population. And partly this is, for some social scientists and as well as for psychologists, obviously generational. So, I would argue that, the younger generational who are more prone to, this continuousness of having lots of different screens, lots of different apps, lots of different social media open all the time, are therefore more likely to be in your category of being distracted all the time, because they're distracted all the time. And I'm not sure whether it's the case that that their memory overall of that particular generation is likely to be more impaired because they completely inhabit this world of distraction, constant dopamine hits of this opening up, and or is it that the fact that they've grown up in a digital era, that they're already kind of very competent at dealing with those kind of that multiplicity of kind of nudges and hits and sounds and messages and images that they inhabit all the time? So would you say it's more, I mean, is there any kind of evidence or research around a particularly younger generation who are absolutely immersed in new emergent social media forms, and particularly, you know, messaging apps where there's a constant exchange of images and videos?
Yeah, it's a great question and an interesting topic. I don't think we have any evidence that directly speaks to it, where we have a really clean comparison between, let's say, you know, a younger generation, and then maybe not going all the way to people my age, but slightly older, and looking at the question of whether you have more detrimental effects as a function of age, let's say starting in adolescence or early adulthood, going up into middle adulthood. That would be a very interesting thing to look at. And I think you outlined two reasonable possibilities. One, that there could be this domain general effect that's already hinted at in some of the literature, but isn't really nailed down, because again, we don't know whether it's the people who start out with poor memory, who then are more likely to engage in multimedia tasking because of that, or whether there's a causal effect of multimedia tasking. But I think the generational perspective is going to be an important one to pursue, but I don't think we yet have the data, and it really could go either way. Right. There could be more of an effect there, or as you say, there could be a kind of adaptation effect that this is not going to have as detrimental effect as you might fear, because it's just been incorporated into the sort of normal operation of the system.
Because one of the features of the social media environment today is, you know, especially in the past 5 years, is what I would call nudge memories. So, you know, these apps and social media that remind you of an event or an experience from 1 year ago, 5 years ago. Do you remember when this? And Apple, for example, you know, actually call it memories. Here are your memories. You know, this is the same thing as your human memory. These are your memories. So we're constantly being reminded, aren't we? You know, we're constantly being nudged. You know, this is, you know, and obviously that has certain adverse consequences when you're reminded of, you know, of an awful experience, or an ex-partner, or a wedding that was postponed, that you're constantly barraged with images and adverts for weddings, etc., and images of you with your former partner. And it strikes me that there's an interesting thing going on there. We've got our kind of human individual memory, and then we've got our digital memory, and the digital memory seems to have a life of its own, you know, a kind of trajectory that keeps going on despite our changes, you know. So despite the fact that I'm no longer in this relationship with X, the photographs of X keep nudging me, keep reminding me. So that strikes me as a very powerful shift in how digital technologies and media are actually shaping and it, you know, invading, and, you know, it's very intrusive, isn't it? You know, kind of an intrusive. And I just wondered if you had any comments on that, where you think that actually might be reshaping a whole generation's human memory.
Yeah, again, that's one that it's a big question. It's an important question. We don't have, you know, data that directly speak to it. However, I would put it in the context of the more general fact, I would say, about human memory, that we know that even without digital technologies, it's constantly being reshaped and resculpted by what we retrieve and what we don't retrieve, with the idea that, you know, retrieval has a very potent effect on sustaining a memory into the future. So there can be a positive effect there. And so if we think of the digital media as basically supplying retrieval cues of various kinds, those retrieval cues would operate to, and this is implicit in what you're saying, to sustain certain memories. And there could be some upside and downside to that. We might have a stronger memory for an experience we really want to remember as a function of being reminded. But as you point out, we might be reminded of painful memories as well that we wish we could forget. The other side of that is that when we remember a certain experience, there can be a detrimental effect, a forgetting effect on related but non-retrieved information. And in fact, in my lab, over 20 years ago, we had a project going on photographs in memory and how looking at photographs, we didn't have Instagram then and we didn't have Facebook, but just how reviewing our experiences through photographs could impact memory. Not surprisingly, we found that you have better memory for those experiences. These are lab-based experiences that you review in a photograph. But what was interesting is that we also had some evidence that memory for related but non-retrieved events was suppressed. So I think that more generally would apply to things like Instagram and so forth. Those aspects of acute experience that we retrieve, yeah, they're going to be perpetuated, but we might also be resculpting our memories whereby the things we don't retrieve are really going to become more difficult to remember in the future. So I would say, yes, it's absolutely going to have a strong effect in reshaping memory, but in principle, it's not really much different than any other form of post-event memory retrieval, which is going to have the multiple consequences that we're talking about.
And I mean, in my work, I kind of constitute this relationship in my broad social sciences, non-experimental, non-evidential work, as a relationship of dependency rather than the reliance. So, we read all the time about people who have tried to detox in social media. I'm going to turn my email and my social media off for a week or a month. But what's typical of all those examples of people who tried this detox, assuming that the digital media, social media is bad for them in some way, is that they always return to it. So I kind of put it to you that, in terms of, you're certainly suggesting that in terms of retrieval, this is something that's not necessarily new to human memory. It's a different form of retrieval. So if I push you a bit further and say, well, but this sense of a dependency, could be a potential difference in the sense that, we, not just in memory terms, obviously, but our inability to live without social media technology and communications, because we need it for work, for leisure, for survival, for accessing services, and all of those things. And it strikes me that memory is kind of, yanked up with that. It's hooked up with that, and it's part of that. So would it be fair to characterize increasingly, again, we're talking at domain general level. I know it's difficult for us to do it with any certainty, but so I'm trying to push you a bit beyond the evidence. But would you characterize it as an increasing dependency rather than reliance on technology and media for remembering?
Yeah, I think for reasons you outline, we can see that there probably is a form of dependency, but it's not clear to me that dependency is primarily driven by memory related issues as opposed to need for approval, involvement, in a social group, things like that. I would imagine really are the critical drivers of the dependency rather than something specifically related to memory. I mean, that might be in the mix, but I wouldn't think it would be a major factor in driving the dependency. Now, if there is this dependency and people are constantly returning to social media, there are going to be effects on memory. But again, just from where I sit, I wouldn't think it's the memory part that's the primary driver of that dependency that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. I mean, your kind of article speaks to an important issue for our journal, kind of closing the gap between the lab and the world, which is, obviously your work over many years. And obviously the problem when we speak about memory, it means so many different things to different people. I mean, and interdisciplinarity, between the social sciences, humanities, and human sciences is I mean, it's not common, is it? I mean, it's really difficult. And I just wondered if you saw any signs of changes or any ways in which we might begin to kind of bridge more of these differences between in the lab and in the world.
Yeah, I think it is a tough nut to crack. I think that the existence of journals such as this one that is coming into being are, important toward fostering interdisciplinary discussion. And I will say that, some of us in the memory area have been at this for a while. So I think back to a conference on memory distortion that I and several of my colleagues at Harvard organized in spring 1994 that resulted in an edited volume called Memory Distortion, published by Harvard University Press, where we brought together psychologists, neuroscientists, historians, sociologists, political scientists. So we had a real interdisciplinary group trying to converge around those issues. And what I found then, and we had a terrific volume with a lot of different perspectives, but that what I found then, and what I think is still true now, and where I hope this journal can be helpful, is that it is very difficult to get beyond the basic constructs and language of our own discipline to even have a good sense of, are we talking about the same thing when we use the term memory? Yeah. One important area that's really grown in the last 20 years is the area of work on collective memory. And even there, when we talk about memory, we're obviously using it in a slightly different sense than when we talk about human memory and individuals. So I talk about my memory for what I had for dinner last night. How does that line up versus our memory of the Civil War or World War I? We're using the same term, but there's a different underlying construct. So I think the important thing is that we're all clear about exactly how we're using these terms. And I think when you have that clarity, and then you have a forum where people from different perspectives can get together, then you have a chance of breaking through those barriers. But it is a non-trivial task to come to some common conceptual understanding across our various disciplines.
Thank you. Another concept that's tricky for maybe different reasons is forgetting. I am trying to write forgetting. I just find it impossible because in the social sciences and humanities, we don't have a trajectory of methods, concepts, theories, frameworks for writing about forgetting. Whereas, psychology, you have a much more developed literature, methods, and work on forgetting. Whereas there's been so much written on memory, the social sciences of memory, there's memory booms and there's books and there's research projects that go on for decades and decades and decades. But forgetting is still kind of very much under the radar in the social sciences. And what's clever, I think, about your work is that you talk about forgetting, but you talk about it in terms of memory, you talk about the sins of memory rather than this term forgetting. I mean, is there, and this is a kind of a personal interest of mine rather than anything to do with the journal as much, in the sense that where do you think the trajectories of work on forgetting are? Where would you say, how can we develop how can we make forgetting more visible? Everyone often talks about memory and forgetting. Forgetting is always kind of memory's silent partner. It's always something we kind of add on because everyone focuses on memory because we have got clear and easy metaphors and concepts, and we've got a language of memory and remembering. It's dominant in culture. But forgetting is just not there, and yet, of course, it's always the other side of remembering. It's part of it. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered, sorry, partly convoluted question, but how can we make forgetting more visible? What are the ways in which we can bring this more to the fore? I mean, we talk about memory studies. Shouldn't there be a forgetting studies as well of some equivalence?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite from that perspective. We could have a journal of forgetting. Well, I think number one is we have to, certainly what we realize in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, where I come from, is that there are different kinds of forgetting and different mechanisms. So it's one word, but even within the context of the 7 sins, the first 3 sins of omission are all different kinds of forgetting. And the important point about contrasting transience, loss of information over time, absent-mindedness, breakdown of it at the interface of attention and memory, and blocking, information is available but can't be retrieved at the moment despite an effort to retrieve that information with full attention, is that different kinds of forgetting can occur for totally different reasons. That's really one of the driving points of making those distinctions in the 7 sins, and other people in psychology talk about that in different ways. Maybe one thing would be to realize that when we're talking about forgetting, because as you point out, it is kind of the flip side of memory or remembering, we're not just talking about one thing. We're likely talking about multiple underlying mechanisms that produce this output, which is some kind of absence of information. The other point to note from psychology, and again, this relates to the 7 sins and what I talked about earlier, and the adaptive perspective, is that we tend to think of forgetting as bad, and it is in certain respects. Certainly if you forget information on a test that you need to produce to pass the test, that's a bad thing. If I can't remember where I put down my car keys or glasses and I spend 10 minutes looking for it, that's a bad thing. But as I alluded to earlier, and many people have made this point in psychology, there are many adaptive aspects of forgetting, and those have come more into the fore, certainly in psychology. So I think all of that has to be brought to bear on the concept of forgetting when we move out of psychology into the broader domains that you're referring to.
Sure, absolutely. And one of the, to go back to technology and media again, one of the transformations of late is the speed of communication, the speed of personal messages and images, and messaging of GIFs and memes, and this relates to, so some of your 7 sins come together here. I think transience, the ephemerality of picture messaging, blocking, very much the sense of overload of millions of images circulating and potentially available that we can't look at all the time, and suggestibility. This is the point I made earlier on about the idea of nudging yes. people to click on this image or that video through algorithms. And I think relatedly, some people argue that if you put this together, what they argue is about, in terms of digital archives and algorithms and overload and loss, some people predict a kind of coming of a kind of digital dark age, in the sense that this is no longer accessible anymore. So I wonder if you could comment on that in relation to the 7 sins. I think one way of putting the question then is, with the millions of images that flow across us every day, or potentially anyway, is the single image kind of less more difficult to hold in focus? So is memory in 20 years from now more likely to be a stream of disconnected images, events, and experiences, rather than say a defining iconic image, which of course a lot of the psychology literature focuses on, what's your memory of this particular event or this particular experience, or 9/11 or Challenger, go back to the whole history, isn't there, flashbulb memories? And is that kind of challenged by the, obviously we can't watch and access millions of images, but their sheer availability today. So 20 years from now, will we be having a kind of, similar conversation about what we remembered 20 years ago?
Yeah, interesting point. I think that, again, we come back to that distinction we talked about earlier of task-specific, domain-specific, and domain general. What you're talking about here potentially would be like the ultimate domain general effect, where by engaging with and frequently experience social media and the run of images that you talk about, you eventually fundamentally alter the underlying experience of memory for in multiple domains. So I'm skeptical that it's ever going to come to quite that. I think that there would be something closer to task-specific effects where, as you point out, when we're overwhelmed with the flow of images, any one image might be more difficult to remember. But does that mean that my fundamental experience of memory, even outside the domain of social media, is going to be different, really fundamentally different than it would have been otherwise? A domain general effect in my parlance. It's an interesting question. I think it'll be something that from a psychology perspective would be worth looking into. It'll be tough to study, but it's certainly interesting to ponder that even as a possibility. The other point to come up here, and you mentioned suggestibility, is that we are already seeing effects. I would characterize them as of a task-specific form, is in the potential for social media and the internet to create certain kinds or contribute to certain kinds of false memories. So we've certainly all heard about fake news. Everyone knows about fake news. And there have been some studies, and I talk about them in the article now, a couple that have shown that exposure to fake news of various kinds can result in false memories, where people claim to remember an event that never happened because they've seen a fake news headline and a photo depicting that event. And then they say, oh yeah, I really do remember that event. So that would be what I would call a task-specific effect. You have an effect on that one particular event. I think that is now documented. Sure. And I talk about those studies in the article. The more open question, again, is would that produce something, a broader effect, a domain general effect, where if you've got exposure to enough of these fake news items and enough of these false memories of events that never happened, that you start creating false memories kind of all over the place. You become more prone, more generally, to false memories. We don't have any evidence indicating that kind of a broad effect, but we do know that some people are more prone to developing false memories through suggestion than others. So it's not inconceivable that effect, a domain general effect, could eventually happen, but I don't know of any evidence that it has yet happened.
Great, thank you. So in terms of recent times, there's been a lot of work around disinformation and fake news, but obviously we're living through a global pandemic. I mean, how do you think we will remember or forget the global pandemic? As far as I can see, what's distinctive from the global pandemic is how much we see about people trying to remember it. So, there's thousands of public requests to collect, document, and remember. Curators, museums, archives, organizations, send us your memories, collect this, collect that,
right.
Photograph this. And obviously a lot of this is driven by our capacity to record anything and everything. So the global pandemic is, for me, occurring in this era whereby we routinely record everything. So, and there's been some written about how earlier pandemics have been forgotten for various reasons over history. People often don't want to remember really traumatic or bad or effects, and memories directed in all kinds of ways by all kinds of people with the capacity to direct memory about political decision making or medical decision making. But this global pandemic, do you think that all of these attempts that I've described will result in this kind of wonderful, amazing kind of mass digital memory? Or do you think the opposite will be the case? This overload, a kind of blockage in your terms, through the kind of sheer scale and also sheer disorganization of memory. If it's not, if all this memory is not encoded in a particular way, then will it go down that black hole of the digital dark age?
Yeah, a lot of interesting possibilities there. I have a few thoughts on it. One is that because for many of us, the pandemic had a fairly sharp onset in roughly March 2020, where certainly in in the United States and North America. It had already been going on to some extent for a month or more prior to that in Europe, and particularly Italy. But for many of us in March 2020, there was kind of a sharp onset where it was literally within 1 or 2 days, life completely changed. We stopped going into work and we were all in our homes. And I think everybody has a story about that, exactly what happened to, what happened to them. So I think certainly the onset of it will be probably well remembered, either, through the with some influence of media or even without that. That just reflects basically in memory research what we would call a primacy effect. If I give you a list of words to remember the first few and last few the best. And so I think there'll be a strong primacy effect, and everyone has their kind of pandemic story of how it all started for them. And more generally, I think people will have their own pandemic stories that they talk about, that they post on social media. Those will be reinforced through processes that we've discussed already. However, another thought is that I think a lot of the pandemic at a personal level will not be well remembered because we were out of our daily routines. Most of us were in our homes for like a year or more. Days blended into one another in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily. We didn't have the vacations, the trips, the kinds of things that segment one event for another, make them more discriminable. So I would expect that there, again, going back to the word list example and word list in the laboratory example, you remember those first few things well. In the middle of the list is not so well remembered. And here, I think there are a lot of reasons why the middle of the list or the middle of the pandemic may end up being a very generic, hazy kind of memory, because you don't have the normal landmarks that segment events from one another. And then we come out to the other side now, for at least for many of us, and not for all of us, where, wow, now we can go to a restaurant. Now, I watched the Boston Bruins hockey playoff game the last couple of nights. The stands are full of fans again. So everyone's going to have their recency effect coming out of the pandemic, what they did, how they first started going back. So I think those will be notable features. I would think the primacy and recency portions will be well remembered, and we're at risk of losing a lot of that stuff in the middle because it's going to end up being fairly indistinct. Again, all of this will interact with media in interesting ways, but I think that's going to be kind of an overlay on whatever media effects there are, strong primacy and recency, and potential loss or haziness in the middle.
And would you agree with my assumption that we're living through a time whereby memory is seen as more important? There seems an obsession that everything should be commemorated, memorialized, remembered, documented, archived. This isn't a new idea. People talk about memory boom. Jay Winter talks about the memory booms of the 20th century. Obviously after the World Wars and the Holocaust, a sense of a need to remember. But it strikes me the 21st century is characterized by an obsession to remember, to document. From everything that's vital and important and seen as significant to the most trivial and nonsensical too, as well as all the politics of remembrance as well. So would you characterize this time, especially recently, of an era of kind of obsession with memory? And if so, why do you think we're going that way?
Yeah, interesting question. I think that there might be a number of factors, to the extent that and I agree, I think there is something in the direction of an obsession with memory. But to me, the question would be, is it truly an obsession with memory when, again, we focus on media, internet, and technology? Is it truly an obsession with memory, or is the memory bit of it a result of more opportunity to preserve experiences?
Yeah.
wanting to share with other people, show them what you're doing. And then that naturally leads to memory down the road. So is it a primary obsession with memory that's really driving this, the need to remember, or is it the need to communicate with other people? There are new ways of communicating and sharing with other people, and a byproduct of that is more of a focus on memory, even though that may not be driving all of it. So I think it's, they're bits of both that are contributing to what we currently see in the domain of media and technology.
Yeah, so there are already existing, in the first 5 years of my son's life, probably 1,000 times more images of him than there was in my entire lifetime.
Right.
And that's simply because we obviously endlessly document and share photographs and images of him because it's so easy to do with the smartphone.
Yes.
You don't have to get some special apparatus or seek out some particular technology or a special moment to do it. It's just continuous, and then you edit and select and share. So I'd agree, it's absolutely the technology that's driving it, but also, and this is, again, a slightly different point, it seems to me that there's a new politics of memory. So for instance, in the UK, they're even going to try and put on a Brexit museum. So it seems, that already, that if you've got something that politically you think is important, but rightly or wrongly, for whatever reason, that one way to advance your cause is to attach memory to it, is to memorialize it, is to create an exhibition, is to create a museum, is to create an artwork, is to create something that that is related to memory, because memory in some ways legitimizes whatever it is you want to advance. And I see that as a kind of growing and deepening trend that is next to the digital technologies, but obviously related to it as well, because it's so easy to do.
Yeah, there are just more ways to do it now than there were in the past. So it's an interesting question as to whether more events or occurrences, political and otherwise, are being memorialized, because now it doesn't even have to be that important in order to memorialize, as opposed to, let's say, a World War II museum or a Holocaust museum. Now we're going to go for Brexit, and we're going to go for things that are maybe not as monumental. That to me would indicate exactly what you said, a greater need to memorialize and possibly to establish a legitimacy of a particular issue. So it could be that, or it could be that it's just something we can do in a different way that we've always done, but now we have more ways of doing that.